Hey everyone, and welcome. Today, we're going to dive into a story that's really at the heart of India's industrial history, the rise of trade unionism. And this isn't just a dry story about rules and laws. No, it's about the fundamental fight for a voice, for basic rights, and for dignity in the workplace. So let's jump right in. But first, let's kick things off with a big question. Think about it. In a massive factory or some sprawling corporation, how does one single worker actually make their voice heard? How do they get any real power? Well, that's the whole reason trade unions exist. It's the key to this entire story. This movement didn't just pop up out of nowhere. If you look at this timeline, you can see its roots go back more than a century, born from the really harsh realities of early industrial work. You can see these key moments, a huge growth spurt in the 1920s, then a complete game changer in 1926, and a massive expansion after independence. This has been a long journey. So before we get into all the legal stuff, we really have to understand that initial spark. What was the deep human need that drove this whole thing? Why did all these individual workers feel like they absolutely had to band together?
Well, it really boils down to these core goals, and believe me, they are anything but abstract. We're talking about a fair wage to actually support your family, safe working conditions, reasonable hours so you can have a life outside the factory. It's about job security, and maybe most of all, gaining just a little bit of control over your own life. But all those desires, they were pretty much just wishes, until one absolutely pivotal moment. See, the movement needed a solid legal foundation to turn these scattered groups into powerful, recognized organizations. And that foundation, that cornerstone, was laid in a single transformative year.
1926. This is the year. This is when everything changed. It marks the precise moment that the Indian trade union movement went from being a bunch of protests to being a legally defined and, importantly, protected force.
And that landmark law was the Trade Unions Act. Its aim was, beautifully simple, but also incredibly powerful. It didn't just nod at unions and say, okay, you exist. No, it created an official rule book. It laid out how to register them and define the law for them. For the very first time, this gave them real legitimacy, a proper seat at the table.
So how did it actually work? Well, the process was surprisingly straightforward. All it took was 7 or more people to agree on some rules. They'd send an application to a government registrar, and if everything was in order, boom, the registrar issued a certificate, and just like that, a legally recognized trade union was born. It was a clear path from being a small group to having official power. And with that registration came some major benefits. A union could now act like a person, legally speaking. It could own property, sue someone, be sued, and maybe the biggest deal of all, it gave its leaders and members legal immunity for things they did during a strike or trade dispute. That kind of protection was an absolute game changer.
But, and this is a big but, these new rights came with new responsibilities. This law was definitely a two-way street. Unions now had to be transparent. They had to keep proper accounts, submit annual reports, and keep their general and political money separate. So the big takeaway here is that the act balanced these powerful rights with clear duties. It was all about accountability.
Okay, so that's the legal foundation. But what do these unions actually look like on the inside? What's their blueprint? Well, while they can all be a little different, most of them follow one of two basic designs.
The two main models are craft unions and industrial unions. You can see the difference pretty clearly here. A craft union is exclusive. It's just for workers with a specific skill, like, say, electricians. An industrial union, on the other hand, is totally inclusive. It brings everyone in a single industry together, from the engineers to the mechanics to the cleaners, all in one car factory.
Right, let's fast forward to today. That 1926 foundation has supported the growth of this huge, complex union landscape we see now. But as the movement has gotten bigger, it's also started facing a whole new set of challenges.
So why are unions still so important? Well, the core reasons haven't changed. People still want economic security and a real voice at work. But today, there's also this huge need to balance out the incredible power of giant corporations. And especially in India, you see the massive influence of political parties, which adds a whole other layer of complexity.
But here's the twist. All this success, this massive growth, it hasn't been a simple story. In fact, it's created a whole new set of really complicated problems. and a lot of them are coming from inside the movement itself. One of the biggest issues is rivalry. Instead of one strong, unified voice, you often get multiple unions competing for members inside the very same company. And they're usually tied to different political parties. This just leads to infighting about who gets to negotiate with the boss. The real irony? It can totally fracture and weaken their collective bargaining power, the very strength in numbers that unions were created for in the first place.
Now, to try and counter some of that fragmentation and get a bigger voice, unions often band together into larger structures. You can see the breakdown right here. While most unions, 60%, are local, a lot of them join up with regional or even really powerful national federations. This is how smaller groups can team up to influence policy on a much, much bigger scale.
So, what's the big takeaway from all this? It's that what started as a simple spark of necessity, that basic human need for fair shake, has evolved over 100 years into this complex legal and social structure. Love 'em or hate 'em, unions are an absolutely defining feature of India's industrial story. And that leaves us with one final, really important question. I mean, in an age of gig work, remote teams, and AI, the very meaning of work is changing right before our eyes. So looking ahead, what's the union's next chapter? What does collective power even look like in the 21st century? Thanks for joining me.